This video is designed to help you relax or fall asleep. Before we begin, if you're planning to drift off while watching this video, please take a moment to introduce yourself in the comments or simply say hello. Your comments truly make a difference. Also, if you haven't already, liking the video and subscribing means a lot. It's incredible to see people tuning in from all over the world. Thank you once more. Get cozy, turn off the lights, get yourself a glass of water and make sure you lock the door. Remember to drop a hello in the comments. It's time to close your eyes. I lived with my older brother for about 4 years after I finished school. We shared rent on an apartment together since neither of us could afford anything on our own. But during the 4th year, my brother started making better money and he planned to move out once the lease came to an end. I wasn't making a lot, so I knew I couldn't afford to pay for the apartment alone. I looked around online for a roommate for a few months but decided to move out as well and find a cheaper place. I searched until the last month of our lease at the apartment. My brother had basically moved everything out already, and there was a lot of pressure on me to find somewhere quick. But with my extremely low budget, it was hard. Eventually, I stumbled across a listing posted by a homeowner renting out a room in their house. The man's name was Evan. I sent him a text to let him know I was interested, then kept searching. He responded within a few minutes. We scheduled a time to call later in the day, and when we did, he explained all the details. He said he lived alone in the house and was renting out his spare bedroom, but I'd be able to use all the other rooms in the house. It sounded great to me, so I agreed to it. A couple of weeks later, I packed everything in a U-Haul and drove down to the house. Between this time, we'd been texting and calling, and he sent me a bunch of pictures, but I hadn't had the chance to view it in person yet. I got there around noon, parking in the driveway. The house was definitely small, but it looked nice from the outside. Evan was standing in the garage, waving me over. He gave me a quick tour, then helped me unload all of my stuff into my room. Evan seemed like a regular man in his mid-30s, which was almost 10 years older than myself, but I didn't really mind. He didn't hold conversations very well, and was somewhat shy. Anyway, we finished moving everything inside, and I dropped the U-Haul off. I Ubered back to the house, and by then, it was almost 8 p.m., and I was really tired. Evan was on the couch, watching TV, so I told him I was going to bed early, and I went to my room. All in all, it seemed like a decent place, and I was happy with it. I unpacked some more, then set up my bed, and by 9 o'clock, I was finally ready to sleep. I walked over to my door to lock it and turn off the lights. But as I reached my hand out, I saw the knob on the door was empty. As in, there was no lock on it. Confused, I opened the door. The lock was on the outside of the door. I stepped into the living room and asked Evan why the bedroom door locked from the outside. He looked confused and said he never noticed that, but he would switch it around tomorrow. I shrugged and said okay, then went back to my room. I was tired and not too worried about it, but it was definitely an odd find. I got in bed and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I heard someone moving around in the kitchen, which I assumed was just Evan getting water or something. I closed my eyes again. A minute later, I heard him walking back down the hallway, but as he was passing my room, he stopped. I opened my eyes and looked at the door. He was standing out there quietly for maybe 15 seconds before I heard a click. He locked my door. My stomach dropped, and I felt my face go cold as Evan walked down to his room. As soon as I heard his bedroom door shut, I got up quietly and went over to the door. I tried the handle, and it wouldn't budge. I stood in shock for a few seconds, coming to the reality that this man I just met has now locked me in a room. My fear started to turn into anger, and I called out for Evan, telling him to open the door. It only took a second before I heard Evan run out of his room and over to my door. I heard him place his hand on the door, but he paused for a few seconds before he unlocked it. I swung the door open right away. What the hell was that? I confronted him. Evan was stumbling over his words, saying he just wanted to make sure he was safe because he didn't know me well enough. I understood that concern, but locking someone in a room was not a smart way to go about it. I told him that I was going to pack up and leave in the morning. I stayed up all night on the couch in the living room, waiting for the U-Haul store to open at 9 o'clock. I looked into the hallway, seeing Evan's bedroom door was still closed, hopefully meaning he was still asleep. Then I drove straight there and drove the U-Haul back to the house. When I went inside, Evan's bedroom door was open. "Evan?" I called out. I walked over to his room and peeked my head inside. His room was empty. I moved my eyes around the room in disbelief, seeing as things were only getting weirder. I backed out and got straight to moving my stuff. I powered through 2 hours of moving boxes and taking apart my bed. I only had 2 boxes left, and I ran inside and picked up another, then rushed to the front door until Evan appeared in the doorway. "Move," I said. He stared at me emotionless. After a few seconds, he stepped aside. I hurried past him and shoved the box in the U-Haul. The last box was half full of random food I kept from my old pantry at the apartment. I decided to just leave it. Evan was freaking me out, and I wanted to get away from him as soon as possible. I started closing the back of the U-Haul before Evan interrupted. "You forgot this." He held out the last box. "Oh yeah, thanks." I grabbed it from him and climbed back into the truck. I felt him watching me as I stacked the box, and when I turned, he had his hand on the door. He started pulling it down, trying to close me in. I was able to stop him before the door was even halfway down. I shoved him to the ground, but he got up and ran. Not into the house, but off into the trees, away from the property. I didn't know what to think, but I didn't care. I quickly shut the back door and drove away. My brother was nice enough to let me stay with him until I found a new place. I don't know what happened at that house, or what would have happened, but there was definitely something very wrong going on. This all happened roughly around 4 years ago, but the experience has haunted me almost every single day since it happened. I'll start off by saying that at the time I was pretty young. I was single and very keen to have my first experience with someone. I spent a while looking through dating apps, talking to a few people, until I finally came across a guy who seemed interesting. We had a lot of things in common, so I thought it would be a good idea to meet up with him since we had been talking for almost a month. Now, even though I was only young, I wasn't naive or stupid. I was, and still am, a very cautious and paranoid person. But for some reason, I made what possibly could have been one of the worst decisions of my life. I invited him to come spend the night at my place. My parents were away for the weekend and I had the place to myself, so it seemed like the perfect opportunity for him to come over. He lived around 3 hours away from my place, yet he was eager and almost desperate to visit. So he set off as soon as he finished work, which was around 11 a.m. The whole time he was driving to my place, I had the sickening sense of impending doom. Almost as if something was going to go very, very wrong. I almost texted him multiple times to tell him that I wasn't interested anymore, but I hesitated as he was only 10 minutes away by this point. I jumped up as I heard his car pull up, and I expected to be greeted by a smile once I opened the door. But he pushed his way through, and continued to stare at me blankly, all whilst my 2 French bulldogs snarled and growled at him, which they never do to anyone. Things instantly seemed extremely odd. He followed me quickly to my bedroom, and didn't waste any time in aggressively undressing me. I hesitantly went along with it, as this was my first experience with someone. He was almost 6 years older than me, so I was pretty tense. Fast forward to a couple of hours later, he suddenly asked me if he could sleep in my room, which confused me as it was only 5 p.m. But I told him it was fine, and I would continue to watch movies by myself downstairs. After about an hour, I heard what sounded like furniture being moved around, and the sound of him talking. So I made my way upstairs and opened my door, only to find him crouching in the middle of my room and breathing extremely heavily. When I asked if he was okay, he motioned for me to get on the bed. He sat me on his lap and proceeded to place a blindfold over my eyes, putting his hands around my neck lightly. I was already feeling extremely uncomfortable, and it worsened as he tightened his grip around my throat. He asked, "Does anyone know I'm here? Do your friends know who I am and what I look like?" I instantly answered, saying that my sister and friends knew he was here. This was a complete lie because I don't have a sister, and my friends were unaware, but something inside of me forced me to say it. After minutes of awkward silence, he stood up to gather his things. I noticed that in his backpack, he had tape, rope, and handcuffs. At first, it didn't concern me as I knew he was into that stuff, but looking back, I think it was intended for something much worse. All of a sudden he said, "I think I'm going to head home. I have a long drive, and I'm rather tired." I didn't hesitate to let him out of my door because I was already extremely uncomfortable. As he left, he failed to even look at me or say goodbye. He raced off down the street as soon as he got into his car. I ran back to my room to see if he had left anything because he'd left in a hurry. I found a note on my desk with the words, "Being nice is what saved you." At the time, I had no idea what the note meant. Now that I think about it, I seriously think that he had very ill intentions toward me. I'm still angry at myself for letting a stranger into my home, which was obviously a big mistake. I immediately blocked him on all of my social media. I am just so lucky that I made it out alive. All I know is that he is now somewhere back in America. I don't really know why he was living in the UK at the time that I met him, but all I can say now is that I am glad that he is many miles away from me. A few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors close enough not to feel isolated. The area had no street lights, so it was very dark at night, especially if there were clouds blocking the moonlight. It didn't bother me though. It made my little house feel even more quaint on dark nights. I got home from work one day in midwinter. It was a cloudy night, so pulling up to my house, I saw only what my headlights and front porch light illuminated. When I got out of my car, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. That was odd, as I had never smelled that before around that house. I didn't see anyone nearby, so I ignored it and went inside. I had just got off a shift with a few hours of overtime, so I felt pretty tired. Even though it wasn't even 7 yet, I decided to take a shower and call it a night. I woke up sometime later, sure that I had heard a noise inside my house. I wasn't worried right away because my friend would sometimes stop by to use my shower after work on his way to his night classes. I even gave him a spare key so he could stop by even if I wasn't home. He would always text me to let me know beforehand though, and I hadn't heard my phone go off. I reached over to my bedside table and picked up my cell phone to see if my friend had sent me a text. The bright light from my phone's screen blinded me. These were the days before phones had a light sensor that would dim the screen in the dark, and this particular phone was so bright, I could use it as a flashlight. Through squinted eyes, I could make out that it was 9-something, but I couldn't tell if I had an unread text or not. I set my phone aside and called out my friend's name. There were a couple of seconds of silence before I heard loud footsteps as someone started running through the bottom floor of my house. I leapt out of bed and ran to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time I had opened the door and stepped inside. That house had 3 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms on either side of the hallway, the one I was in and a spare, and a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed, but the bathroom door was cracked open. I heard whoever was in my house thunder down the hallway past my door and into the bathroom. Thank God he did. That gave me enough time to open the attic access in the ceiling of my closet and hoist myself up. I had just started to lift myself up when the person ran back out of the bathroom. My feet were barely inside of the attic when my bedroom door burst open. I heard footsteps run into my room and stop. When they didn't see me in that room, they ran back to the hallway and into the other room, which just had boxes stacked in a corner, some weights, and a table where I painted my miniature models. I guess they decided that if someone were hiding, it would be in the bedroom, because they charged back into my room and turned on the light. A moment later, the closet door was ripped open. I was crouched in my attic just a foot or so away from the access, so I could try to stop them if they started to climb up. From my vantage point, all I could see was from about their knee down. They were wearing dirty blue jeans with frayed cuffs and work boots. After a few seconds of looking in the closet, they stepped away and I heard a loud crash come from my room, followed by a scream of frustration and anger. That scream was the most unnerving part of the incident for me. It reminded me far too much of my stepfather, who would scream in a similar way when he lost his temper. He would eventually be placed in a mental hospital for several mental disorders that resulted in erratic and violent tendencies. The man in my house ran back down the stairs. I heard crashes and clatters as things were thrown around and furniture was knocked over. I stayed crouched in the attic. I had left my cell phone when I ran for the closet, and I wasn't certain I could climb down without him hearing. After some time, the noises stopped. I started counting slowly. When I reached 1,000, I decided it was safe enough to climb down and call the police. The first thing I noticed when I exited the closet was the intruder had flipped my bed over. I assumed in an attempt to find me. That was the loud noise I had heard after he stepped away from the closet. I couldn't find my cell phone, so I went to the landline by the bed and called the police. I waited in my room until I heard them call out from downstairs. The first floor was a mess, but I had expected that. Chairs had been knocked over, the sofa had been flipped. All the books, pictures, and knickknacks I had on my shelves were strewn across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened and all the boxed and canned foods had been thrown to the ground. As far as I could tell, though, the only thing missing was a single knife out of the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked the house from top to bottom. They found that the side door had been forced open by something like a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along my fence line, along with some foil and an empty pen, which the police said people often use to smoke meth, so they think he had been watching my house for a while. I realized that he must have been out there smoking a cigarette when I got home. They collected up the evidence and told me I should stay with family or friends that night and get that door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep. I moved a shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next couple hours cleaning things up. I would often go to the window with a flashlight and shine it along the fence line where the police found the cigarette butts and foil, but I didn't see anything. The next day I called to have the door fixed and get motion lights installed at the back and sides of my house. I ran a phone cable up into the attic and added a landline. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. Nothing else happened at that house, though. I lived there another 3 years without incident. One more precaution I took was practicing getting out of my bed, going to my closet and climbing into the attic as quickly and quietly as possible. I even practiced doing that at my new place, except now I go to a crawl space at the back of the closet instead of the attic. I try not to think about what would have happened if I had been a bit slower getting to the attic, or if he hadn't gone into the bathroom at the end of the hall first. About 10 years ago, I lived on my own and didn't have much company. I was quite depressed at the time after losing my girlfriend to a drunk driver. I was enjoying a beer and watching the sunset on the back porch when I saw a large, scruffy man emerging from the tree line. My heart skipped a beat as he stumbled towards my house in a menacing way. Living alone, I often used my backyard for target practice. And at that moment, I was immensely grateful for it. Instinctively, I rushed to bolt all the doors while frantically dialing the police. What I didn't know was that this intruder had broken in the day before, through a basement window and had spent the night squatting there. He had left the basement door unlocked, and at this point, he'd made his way inside the house and was making his way up the stairs towards me. I gripped my rifle, aiming at the approaching man as he descended the hallway. I shouted at him, ordering him to stop and get on the ground, but he just kept walking towards me. I fired the first round, loaded with rock salt, but he showed no reaction. I quickly followed with a rubber bullet to the chest. Yet the drugged-up guy, who was clearly out of his mind, continued advancing. This guy was huge, at least twice my size, and I realized that whatever drugs he had in his body were going to push him through any pain that a rubber bullet would inflict. He was backing me into a corner. I desperately begged him to stop and warned him what would happen, but he just moaned at me like a zombie and shouted, "Shoot! Do it!" Then he lunged towards me. I took my third shot. I can't recall whether it was buckshot or a slug, but it left a gaping hole in his chest. It barely even slowed him down. He kept coming, and in a frenzied struggle, he wrestled me to the ground. He was moaning and coughing up blood. Suddenly, he grabbed my face with both of his massive hands and started squeezing my head. It was utterly terrifying. I could feel him trying to burst my skull open like a balloon. I don't know how long it actually lasted, but it felt like forever. Eventually, the injury finally caught up with him, and he died on top of me. I was laying with him crushing me for a few minutes. My energy was completely drained, and I could barely breathe with his weight on top of me. His body was pushing my rifle into my chest, and it was causing me serious pain when I tilted his body to the side. I was completely drenched in his blood, and I can still remember the overwhelming smell. I'd completely forgotten that I was still on the phone with the operator, who had heard our entire exchange, which more or less amounted to me pleading, "Stop, or I'll shoot," and the man menacingly taunting. The police arrived soon after, and the incident made it to the local papers. There was a criminal investigation, but eventually, I was cleared of any wrongdoing. It turned out that the intruder was wanted for murder of an elderly couple in Baltimore and had somehow made his way 50 miles up the road into a rural area. My roommate was out of the house for the week, so I had the place to myself. It was spring break, so my college classes were out. I had no plans and really nothing I needed to do. On Monday, I was basically trapped inside due to a huge storm blowing through our city. This was common around this time of year, but it still always seemed worse every time. The trees always looked like they were going to blow away, and the house would shake and creak non-stop. Knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep, I decided to just stay up. I turned on the Xbox and started up one of my video games and played for well over an hour, probably until 11 o'clock when the doorbell rang. I paused the game and got up, but then I remembered the whole storm situation. Who would be outside right now? I went over to the front door and looked through the peephole, but nothing. I opened the door. The wind and water hit me right away, but when I looked around, I didn't see anyone. I closed the door and thought maybe the wind had somehow rung the doorbell. I don't know, it sounds dumb now, but what was I supposed to think? I went back to my game, but only a couple minutes later, I heard a huge crash in the backyard, stuff tumbling over and breaking. I immediately knew it was our patio furniture and ran over to the back door. Everything was scattered around the yard, blowing around in the wind. I quickly put on my shoes and went outside, pushing each piece of furniture up against the back of the house. The wind was so heavy it would even hurt sometimes when the water would hit my face. I was rushing, going as fast as I could until I saw someone. They were standing at the edge of the backyard, watching me. I looked back at them for a moment, but then grabbed the last piece of furniture and ran inside to escape the rain. I looked out the back door as I dried off, but the person was gone. Between that and the doorbell ringing, I was a little bit nervous. I sat in the living room this time, just scrolling on my phone because I was tired of being interrupted. After a while, I struggled to keep my eyes open. I got a blanket and laid down on the couch. I didn't feel like going upstairs, and the storm was much louder up there. It took a while, but eventually, I drifted off and fell asleep. A few hours later, still well into the night, I woke up from a sudden burst of heavy wind outside, shaking the house. I pulled the blanket to the side and sat up, moving my feet to the floor as I prepared to go check if the furniture outside was still there. But just when my feet touched the floor, they were soaked. It woke me up immediately. I looked down and saw a puddle on the ground right next to the couch. Then I saw another, leading in a line across the floor. Inside the puddles were faint muddy shoe prints. I stood up and ran to the corner of the room, heart beating rapidly in my chest. After a minute of hearing nothing but the wind outside, I slowly followed the shoe prints. They led all throughout the house, upstairs and down, but I could clearly tell that they entered through the back door, which I had stupidly forgotten to lock in the rush of getting out of the rain. I locked it and pulled my phone out to call 911, but then the thought crept into my mind, what if they're still inside? I stayed quiet and moved into the corner of the house where I felt the most hidden. I waited in silence for them to arrive. When they did, they took a look around, seeing everything I saw, but nothing more. They told me it seems like a personal attack because nothing was missing, and they were clearly focused on my house in particular. However, they walked right up to me while I was sleeping and seemingly did nothing but watch me, which is super creepy but doesn't make much sense. If they wanted to do something to me, they would have done it at that moment. After some thought, this had led me to believe that whoever it was had actually come from my roommates. They saw me, then looked around the whole house, and then left, doing absolutely nothing. So if this was a personal attack and my roommate was there, I think things may have gone a lot worse than they had. I'm a wilderness survival instructor and security contractor. A couple of days ago, a good friend of mine, who is also one of my students, informed me that his dad just acquired 150 acres of land in a secluded and mountainous part of my state. This is someone with whom I've explored the woods before. He's more than competent when it comes to wilderness survival. The property, largely unexplored except for 100 yards that his dad had used for his horses, who are currently roaming freely, seemed intriguing. According to my friend, his dad got an incredible deal on the land. Given my friend, now a father of 3, doesn't get out into the woods often, I agreed to join him for what seemed like a fun outing and much-needed break. We share interests in our indigenous roots, cars, wilderness survival, and various other activities, ensuring lively conversations while in the woods. However, his dad cautioned us against exploring the woods without a gun, citing the presence of coyotes. But being natives of this area, we know coyotes rarely pose a threat to people. Additionally, my friend, whom we'll call DJ, previously mentioned seeing human-sized movement in the tree lines during his earlier visits to the property. Yet, due to his poor eyesight, he couldn't confirm what he had seen. For our exploration, I brought along my AR and a small flint napping kit, mainly for amusement. And off we went onto the property. Initially, we hiked across fields and creeks, multiple natural springs, and ponds, everything appearing normal and showcasing a beautiful landscape. But as we ventured into the unexplored forested section, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The forest exuded an eerie ambience reminiscent of the woods in the movie The Ritual. Gray and ominously quiet, except for the occasional creaking of the tall cedar trees. It felt like we were being observed from every angle. The air carried a putrid stench, akin to rotting flesh. Intrigued, we followed the smell and stumbled upon the remains of 3 to 4 cows. I took a video of them to show them to anyone who might know what could have done this. Examining the exposed skulls revealed no evidence of bullet wounds. Something had killed them, scattering their bones over a 30-yard area. Large and vague footprints surrounded the remains. Pressing deeper into the woods, a Accompanied only by silence, the smell of death, and the sound of our own heartbeats, we noticed various tracks along the stream. There were large coyote prints and something else, also large, intentionally avoiding the sand. Continuing, we encountered trees bent over and pinned behind others while still alive. An occurrence impossible in nature. Further along, we discovered what resembled a primitive tool made of bone, possibly a scooping tool or knife. It disturbed us because although rudimentary, it appeared more primitive than anything a human would make, yet clearly shaped intentionally. Our hike led us to a clearing with a pond encircled by large circular tracks. On the opposite side of the pond stood a peculiar little tree structure, an A-frame with rocks propped against it. However, it lacked stability, and the arrangement of rocks seemed oddly deliberate. Notably, there were no signs of campfires or camping debris nearby. This wasn't a location easily accessible from a house. I extensively photographed and filmed this strange hut-like structure. As dusk approached, we decided it was time to head back. I had a flashlight attached to my AR, but relying on that in the dark, when there's something out there capable of killing cows and making tools out of their bones, didn't seem wise. We retraced our steps out of the forest, reaching our trucks just before it became too dark. While leaving, we noticed an unidentified figure atop one of the hills, but chose not to investigate further. It's worth mentioning that the previous owner commenced construction on the property, abruptly stopped, and vacated the premises. We're planning on going back there again this weekend, but this time with a few more people and all of our camping gear. I grew up in these woods and usually feel comfortable there. However, I stumbled into a few unsettling situations that would stick in my mind forever. This was one such occasion. I was 18 at the time. One evening, my two friends, Mike and Paul, and I decided to go camping. Well, camping might not be the right word since we didn't plan to spend the night, just chill and have some fun around the campfire for a while. The plan was simple: head out, build a campfire, drink a few bottles of wine, eat something, and head back home for a good night's sleep. We met at my house while it was still sunny outside, got ready, and headed out. Our destination was an old abandoned quarry in the middle of the woods, about 40 minutes from my house. Even though the quarry had a tragic and frankly creepy history, it was a popular place for such occasions. When we got there, the sky was already reddish as the sun slowly sank behind the hills. We quickly gathered all the firewood we could find so we wouldn't have to look for it later. As darkness fell and everything around us turned into impenetrable blackness, we managed to get the fire going. We were in a great mood and were getting ready for our first toast. That's when we realized we made a horrible mistake. We forgot the corkscrew. We attempted to open the wine without it, but quickly gave up. The bottles were quite expensive, and we didn't want to damage them. At this point, it was clear that one of us would have to jog back to retrieve the corkscrew. After some discussion, I volunteered with two conditions. Firstly, they would give me a hatchet in case something went wrong along the way. Secondly, no pranks when I got back. Mike and Paul agreed without hesitation. They handed me a hatchet and a flashlight and sent me on my way. As I jogged through the forest, I heard a noise resembling a boar. Suddenly, I remembered a warning I received from an older hunter a few days ago. He said that at this time of year, boars were getting dangerous, especially at night. I was a bit nervous, but luckily managed to survive unharmed. I arrived safely back home, much to the surprise of my mom, who didn't expect me so early. I explained the situation, she just laughed, I grabbed the corkscrew, and headed back. Not wanting to encounter a boar, I chose another slightly longer path, this time through an open field. After a while, I reached our spot. It was a small clearing surrounded on one side by massive rocks, maybe 70 meters tall, and on the other side by a thick forest. Our campfire was in the middle of the clearing. When I approached it, I realized that there wasn't anybody around, although our backpacks were still on the ground and the fire was burning brightly. Great. We specifically agreed that there would be no pranks when I got back. Those guys think they're funny, I thought to myself. I resignedly sat down near the fire facing the woods. That's the only place where they could have hidden, I thought. I was really tired, and all I could think about was the taste of the exquisite Pinot that we brought with us. I wasn't in the mood for their games, and I was getting quite mad. That's when I heard the snapping of twigs and rustling of leaves from the edge of the forest, maybe 30 meters from where I was sitting. The sound was rhythmic and undoubtedly the sound of somebody walking. I aimed my flashlight in that direction and spotted a tall person wearing a dark hoodie. As I shined my flashlight on him, he stopped walking, turned towards me, and just kept staring motionlessly. Even though he was facing me directly, I couldn't see his face. I shouted, "Paul, you fat jerk. I know you're trying to scare me. We agreed on something, so stop messing around and come out." As I finished, the hooded figure turned and walked deeper into the woods. At that moment, my phone started ringing. I hurriedly took it out of my pocket. It was Mike. I took the call and started barking at him, "Really funny, you guys. I thought we agreed on something. What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about you trying to mess with me. I clearly saw you, so you can come out." Mike seemed frozen for a minute. For what felt like an eternity, all I could hear was his heavy breathing and Paul mumbling something in the background. When he finally snapped back to reality, he said, "Dude, we're at your house." We heard some footsteps. At first, we thought it was you messing with us. But then we got scared and decided to look for you. I forgot my phone at your house, so we couldn't even call you. Just get out of there, and we'll come back for our stuff together. Nonsense. That's just another of your stupid pranks, and I'm not buying it. Hold on a second. There was some incoherent mumbling for a while. "Hey, what's going on?" My mom's voice suddenly came from the phone. My head spun, and my heart skipped a beat as I realized they weren't kidding. Suddenly, a wave of fear ran through my body. However, I managed to convince my mom that everything was fine and that she shouldn't worry. She gave the phone back to Mike. "Just leave everything and come back. We're heading over right now. We'll meet you halfway there. I'm not going anywhere alone again. You better get here quick. I'm waiting for you." I hung up. I didn't want to make any more noise than I already did. I quickly turned off my flashlight and backed off from the light of the fire. I moved all the way to the huge wall of rocks, figuring that if I had my back covered, it would eliminate one possible approach for the unwanted visitor. I stood there in complete darkness, trying not to make a sound while tightly clutching my hatchet, which would be my best friend for the next half an hour. I had to convince myself not to curl into a ball in fear. Even my own body started to betray me as my hearing worsened due to my wildly beating heart. I tried to calm myself, but in the worst-case scenario, every bit of adrenaline would help. After what seemed like an eternity, I spotted 2 weak light beams coming from the forest. I heard Paul shout my name. I'd never been so relieved. I finally ran out of my hiding spot to greet my friends. For quite some time, we just stood there, laughing from relief. We even got a bit cocky and considered staying. After all, there was just one, supposedly, creep lurking between the trees, and there were 3 of us. Funny. Minutes earlier, I was terrified, and suddenly I was full of tough bravado, thinking, what could possibly happen? In the end, good judgment prevailed, and we decided to leave. We packed our things, extinguished the fire, and left. We took our wine bottles to enjoy somewhere else. Somewhere well-lit and safe. I work for a well-known university as a field biologist and have recently been contracted out to the National Forest Service. My first assignment has been in the Potomac district of the Monongahela National Forest. Basically, I receive GPS coordinates and I either drive or hike to the designated spot and do what they want. This could be setting up trail cameras or counters, monitoring equipment, trail surveys and the like, and then recording the data 24 hours after placement. No big deal. I thought it odd that they specifically requested I place the cameras only 3 feet off the ground and some of the infrared cameras in the trees at specified heights. Some of these locations are on designated trails, but some are way off the trail in places that humans would never go. Sometimes, there isn't a hotel or lodging close enough. These are the remote mountains in West Virginia, and the Forest Service has outfitted me in some pretty dank camping gear on the occasions I might have to camp. I am an experienced hiker and camper and have spent many nights alone out in the field due to my career choice. I am a woman, about 5 feet 6 inches and 130 pounds, but not really afraid of anything. Again, the Forest Service has outfitted me well and I wear an emergency beacon that will send every law enforcement officer in the area to my location in no time. So I have been assigned to this district for a few months now and have really enjoyed my work. West Virginia is very remote and unspoiled, and that's why I enjoy my work. I get to see things most people would never see in their lives, and I have had so many positive and almost spiritual moments up until a few nights ago. I was working up near Spruce Knob, which is the highest point in West Virginia. It's essentially a complex system of trails, wilderness areas, camping, that kind of thing. It has also been snowing with howling winds and ice storms. I was camping up there to complete my work, and while the conditions were rough, I was almost enjoying it. My first night in the woods was pretty peaceful. I made dinner, set up camp and drank some whiskey and smoked some really good bud. I snuggled down in my sleeping bag and slept like a rock. It was very cold, but I wear this turtle fur face mask thing and didn't feel the cold too much. I woke up at dawn and went about building my fire back up, and I was starting some coffee when I noticed all this churned up snow around my campsite. Not tracks, just churned up snow like someone or something had kicked it all around. Weird, but whatever. I had a 15-mile hike to set some cameras and didn't have time to really wonder about it. I set off on my hike, did what I had to do, and started back to camp. I never wear headphones or anything like that, because hearing is one of the most important senses in the wilderness. I want to be able to hear any animals, people, etc. before I see them. It was already past dark when I made it back to camp, and I was too tired to do anything except strip down to my base layer, get in my sleeping bag, and pass out. Around 2 a.m., I woke up because I could hear people talking. People. I was about 30 miles up a gravel road that was locked with Forest Service gates and about 10 miles from where my truck was parked, and I could hear voices. I completely lost it. I have a firearm, and I quietly retrieved it from my pack and got back in my sleeping bag and cocked it and waited. I was on high alert, all my senses going wild. Eventually the voices faded and I couldn't hear them anymore, but I never went back to sleep. At daylight, I emerged from my tent to more churned up snow and my 2 trail cameras hanging from a tree about 5 feet from my tent. These were cameras that I had placed 15 miles out from my campsite. I packed my stuff as fast as I could and practically ran back to my truck. Along the way, I saw a lot of footprints all around my site, and when I reached my truck, I discovered it had been broken into and my computer and other equipment had been stolen. I am currently in a luxury log cabin at some resort, too scared to retrieve my other equipment and too embarrassed to tell my superiors how scared I am. The Forest Service brought me a new truck while my other one is getting the window replaced, and I did make a report about the theft, but there is absolutely no way that I'm ever going back to that site. I don't know if this means I will be fired or sent to work a desk, but out of all the years I have been doing this in national forests around the country, this is the most terrified I have ever been. I am not scared of the animals, and I have many stories to share about my encounters with them. I am scared of the people. I've held this story in for the last 6 years because it sounds crazy and I got told not to talk about it. I went camping 6 years ago with a now ex-boyfriend. The campsite we picked was beautiful. We were able to drive in through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere, absolutely no one was around. We set up camp next to the car, went hiking, soaked in the hot springs, came back, and had dinner. It was all very normal. Until we woke up the next day. I need to give some context as to how we slept that night so you can understand my confusion. Before we went to sleep, I put our food cooler in a stereo that we brought in the car and locked it. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and placed the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the far side of the tent, away from the door of the tent. My boyfriend at the time slept nearest the door of the tent with a gun next to him. When we woke up the next morning, I felt fine. I had slept hard, and from inside the tent, everything seemed normal. When we got out, our campsite was absolute chaos. The fire pit we had made was ruined. The cooler had been thrown, and food was scattered all over the place. The stereo was smashed to pieces, lying next to a tree. All of the car doors were open, including the trunk. We stood there for a minute in silence, just taking everything in. The woods felt strange, it was quiet and not the beautiful campsite that I saw yesterday. Everything about those woods felt wrong. My ex accused me of not locking the car and said that an animal got into our stuff. I promised that I had locked it and went into the tent to grab the keys from my backpack, but they weren't there. I found them later on the ground right next to the car. We quickly threw everything in the trunk and left. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what had just happened. He finally spoke up when we were almost home and told me that he had a dream about something kneeling over him in the tent, holding his gun, and just staring at him. When I tried to ask him more questions, he got quiet again and said he didn't want to talk about it and that I shouldn't talk about it anymore either. I've tried to forget about it, but I just can't. Something really wrong happened to us in the woods that night. This happened about 10 years ago, in August 2013. I was camping in far north Queensland, Australia, in a place called Barron Falls. I'm a 21-year-old girl, and I was camping with my 2 male friends who were backpacking from Estonia, Theo and Charlie. Where we set up camp was not an official campsite. Instead, we walked along the tourist path, climbed over a railing, followed a train track for a few kilometers, and eventually veered off into the dense forest, downhill to the river. It certainly wasn't easy to get to this area, and there wasn't any mobile phone service, but Theo knew about it from friends who had shown it to him previously. The sight was beautiful. We were surrounded by a tropical forest and were only a short walk upstream from the waterfall. After setting up camp, we walked to the waterfall where both Theo and Charlie plunged from the cliff into the water below. I decided not to follow. I was, and still am, scared of heights and the possibility of hurting myself. I sat and watched them for a while before eventually deciding to return to camp and read my book. I was totally relaxed, enjoying the serenity, taking in the beauty around me. What had been an exciting, adventurous day was then interrupted by a deep, sinister laughter coming from the forest surrounding our campsite. Instantly alerted, I felt chills run through my body as I scanned the forest trying to detect where the laughter had come from. There was nothing. I tried to forget about it, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. Theo and Charlie returned and told me that they had forgotten fire lighters for the campfire. They said that they need to travel to the nearest store to buy some and that I should wait at camp. I told them that I didn't feel comfortable staying at camp, but didn't mention the laughter I'd heard before. I didn't want them to think I was stupid, and for context, at the time I had quite a large crush on Charlie. Stupidly, I wanted him to think I was cool. They told me it would be fine, that they would be back before dark. Reluctantly, I agreed, and they made their way to the store. It was about 4 p.m., and I continued reading my book. I began to think about it, and I realized that the walk back to the car was about 20 to 30 minutes, so they would be gone for well over an hour. At this time of year, dusk would be at 5:30 p.m. or so, and I would therefore likely be alone in this remote area in the dark. I distracted myself with my book, but as dusk began to settle, I struggled to read the pages, and fear began to set in. After about an hour, I started to hear footsteps in the forest. My first thought was that Theo and Charlie had returned, and I was instantly relieved that I was no longer alone. I listened for their voices, but heard nothing. My heart dropped. It dawned on me that it may be someone else, and I started panicking. Then came the laughter. The same deep, sinister laughter I'd heard before, only this time it seemed much closer. I sprung to my feet and surveyed the forest. That's when I saw him. He was standing on the other side of a stream, which was connected to the river. Standing on a log, what I saw was absolutely bizarre. He was wearing an immaculate tuxedo, with a top hat and all. I remember being puzzled as to how he was able to get to this area in such clean, formal clothes, and I at first thought he may be an apparition or that I was hallucinating. I did a double take, and I was not. I then studied the man's face. It is hard to describe, but it looked like his face was burnt, like Dwight from The Walking Dead, and he had deep scarring covering his face. His hair was shoulder length, very wiry, and unkempt. He laughed, that same laugh I'd heard from the forest. Miraculously, I heard my friends' voices approaching. The man seemed alarmed, and said that he saw somebody else camping upstream, and that he is going to check on them. He left, and minutes later, Theo and Charlie returned. I immediately told them what happened, and they laughed and thought I was making it up, that it was a lame attempt to scare them. Tears began to gather in my eyes, and Charlie realized that I was serious. Theo didn't seem fazed. He was a very stereotypical backpacker and had the carefree nature travelers tend to have. Charlie, however, assured me that I would be okay and had me sleep between him and Theo for the next 2 nights. I barely slept at all for those nights. I kept listening for the laughter, but fortunately never heard it again. For years after, I searched online for any reports of similar encounters. I never found anything, but I have always contemplated what would have happened if Theo and Charlie hadn't returned at that moment. I shudder at the thought. This happened about 20 years ago, and I don't think I will ever forget it. Back in those days, I was an apprentice hairdresser for one of the top 5 ranked stylists in Japan. Training in that profession at that level was very strict, and beauty standards were a bit different. You probably don't need me telling you that, but it's probably worth keeping in mind. Back to training, it was long, and the time off between sessions was pretty much non-existent. We were expected to be at training even during national holidays. I'm not sure if that was strictly by the books, but as impressionable young stylists, we couldn't be seen refusing training. I think I had about 3 or 4 days off for summer. I took them all at once, and a lot of my friends and coworkers used that time to head back to their hometowns and see families. Since I lived really close to where I was studying, I didn't want to use my time off just hanging around at home. I could do that any time. So, I accepted an offer from one of my seniors to visit his hometown. It was really late by the time I finished work, and we managed to get to my senior's hometown at around 2 a.m. The satellite navigation system told me that we were about 15 minutes away from arrival. The roads were dark and empty. We were the only ones on the road that late. He lived in the middle of nowhere, so that could have been a reason. I remember seeing empty fields on either side of the road. I kind of regretted coming already. I mean, what the hell were we going to do here? He should have probably mentioned that he lived in the rural countryside. I just watched the road and tried to stay awake. I should say that I was driving. I felt like driving since I didn't get to drive much. I might have changed my mind if I had known it was going to be that far to get to his family home. Then suddenly, something appeared out of the darkness in front of the car. A woman with no clothes came running down the opposite lane of the road towards us. I slammed on the brakes because I thought that I just witnessed the paranormal. She ran past us. I looked in the rearview mirror to see a woman between the ages of about 18 to 20 years old. She kept running, then she turned around and ran towards our car. I looked at my friend, and he had a look of disbelief on his face, and I guessed that I didn't have that much of a different look. I think the reality of the situation was we both didn't know what to do. I said to him, "Is that a ghost?" "I don't know. Shall we just keep going?" he replied. We slowly pulled away. I was very skeptical because I thought she looked so real. I made sure I kept to a low speed, and I kept checking the mirrors. The woman got closer, and I stopped the car and said to him, "That's not a ghost. Come on, we have to stop and see if she's okay." He agreed and said he would call out to her. It was so creepy to see someone running around in the middle of nowhere, even creepier if you haven't been to that place before. She kept on running past our car, so I tried to match her speed as my friend rolled down the window and tried to speak to her. "Hey, you shouldn't be running around on the roads like that, this late at night. Maybe you should head home," he said something like that. It wasn't very well put together or that sympathetic, I remember that much. She didn't even turn to face the car, she just said, "Hey, don't worry, I'm fine." It feels so good. I could see her a little closer now and guessed her age to be around 18 or 19 years old. Why are you like this? Have you been kidnapped? Has someone done something to you? It's really dangerous to be out here with no clothes and alone. We have to get you home, I said to her. She stopped running and looked down at the floor as if in thought, and then replied, "I ran away from home. I don't even know where home is." I noticed at that point that she was actually wearing socks and shoes, so at least her feet weren't too bad. She stood there with her hands behind her back, looking completely lost and confused. It was very odd. I couldn't leave her out here. I told my friend in a hushed voice that we had to help her, and he sighed but then nodded. We decided to take her to the nearest police station. I had a dress that belonged to one of my female colleagues at work in the back of my car. Long story short, I told the woman to throw it on, and she reluctantly agreed. Once she was dressed and in the back seat, I turned to her and said, "Right, if you can't remember where home is, I can take you to the police, and we can figure it out from there, okay?" To that, she responded with something outrageous. "I hate the police. They're always on my dad's side. Please, can you just take me to a hotel? Hotels are safer than police for sure. You can stay there with me. Hold me tonight. I'm a virgin." We were young, but even though we were young and often threw caution to the wind, we knew that we had to get her somewhere safe. It's a scary world out there. If she said that to another pair of guys like us in the next car that came along, well, I don't even want to think about it. We told her that wasn't going to happen. She didn't say anything for a while, but then she handed me a piece of paper. I don't know where she got it from, but it had a name, a number, and the address of a hospital. My friend saw the address and said, "Oh, I know that place." It was a psychiatric hospital. We called the number, and a voice that said it was the security department answered. I explained to the security guard what happened, and after we hung up, we got a call from the woman's mother. We found out where her mom lived and took her there. My friend said that he knew that side of town, but he had never been there before. The woman's mother was extremely apologetic over the phone. My friend spoke to her, and he said that he could tell that she was definitely genuine and sorry for the inconvenience. I felt sorry for her. It wasn't her fault. When we got to the house, we heard more about the situation from her mother. The woman we found out in the middle of nowhere had only just turned 18. She had been assaulted by her biological father when she was 16. A few days after he did what he did, she stabbed him in the neck with a box cutter knife. She was admitted to a mental asylum because of this attack. No one seems to know how she keeps getting out, but the mother said to us that this was the third time she'd successfully broken free. What a sensational story, I remember thinking. We drove the mother and daughter to the hospital at the mother's request. I could see how mentally tired she was by all of what had been going on. She was so polite and grateful. She really impressed me. I mean, with all that happened, she seemed to be incredibly in control of her own emotions. The girl didn't seem to say much. She seemed to like the dress we gave her. The mother apologized for not washing it before returning it, and we both agreed that no apology was necessary. Obviously, she got dressed into clothes of her own. She disappeared upstairs to change, and then she came back, and we took off. She didn't say much when we were driving. She was taking being returned to the asylum a lot better than expected. I thought that she would be going kicking and screaming. Her mother spoke with her in the back as we drove. She said, "You didn't get injured or anything when you were out, did you?" "No, I'm fine," the daughter responded. "Oh, that's great. I'm relieved," the mother told her. We left them at the hospital and told them that we couldn't stay because we were already really late getting to my friend's parents' home. My friend's parents were really worried by the time we got there. I think that we both wanted to tell them everything about the situation, but we were too tired to go through it all again. At that point, I just wanted to go to sleep. I stayed with him and his family for 3 days. It was actually a really great time and just what I needed, a break from studies in the city. It was certainly going to be a trip I would never forget. We said our goodbyes to the family, and his little sister asked us for a ride to the station. I said that it wouldn't be a problem. Just before we dropped her off at the station, she said something that scared the hell out of me. "Hey big bro, why does your friend have a box cutter stabbed in the back seat?" So, a quick backstory. I used to live in a very small town, predominantly safe for kids, with only some drug issues. My house was located in a small upscale part of the town. Most people who lived there were families. A small pond with lots of greenery in the neighborhood was about a 5-minute walk from my house. To get to the pond, you had to go down a grass hill. Neighborhood kids, including myself, would always go down to the pond for hours to catch frogs, skip rocks, and enjoy nature. Now, on to the story. On this particular day, it was raining and pretty cold, so there were no other kids at the pond. My best friend, her brother, who was 1 year older than us, and myself, decided to head down to the pond for a bit. After about half an hour, we saw a minivan pull up at the top of the hill. We thought nothing of it, assuming it was probably someone stopping at the neighborhood mailbox. A man, probably in his 60s, got out. In our small town, everyone knew everyone, or at least recognized each other. I found it strange that I had never seen this man before in town or the neighborhood. He just stared at the three of us for what seemed like forever. Suddenly, he yelled at us, saying, "It's not safe down there, you kids better come up here." My best friend and her brother looked terrified, and I had this gut feeling that something wasn't right. We didn't respond, but he kept repeating that phrase. "It's not safe down there. You kids better come up here." Our fight or flight reaction kicked in, and we all sprinted up the other side of the hill, just a few meters away from him and the minivan. As soon as he saw us running, he got into his minivan and started driving slowly behind us, literally following us until we reached my house. Fortunately, my garage door was open and my parents' cars were parked inside. We hid behind one of my parents' cars and watched as he pulled to the side of my house and parked. My parents were inside, unaware of what was happening. He stayed parked in front of my house for a couple of minutes until my dad came outside to take out the trash and saw the three of us hiding. I guess the man saw my dad and drove away, but as soon as he left, we told my parents everything. Even now, 12 years later, my parents still think we were being overdramatic and that the man was genuinely concerned for our safety because of the weather. Nonetheless, we weren't allowed to go back to the pond anymore. I understand why they think this. The three of us tended to exaggerate things and be dramatic. However, I knew from the strange feeling I had when I first saw him at the top of the hill that something was off. To this day, I still believe he was planning something, but maybe it was just my childish imagination. I used to work in a hole-in-the-wall gas station out in the sticks of North Carolina. I was freshly 18, had a new car, a rundown Chevy, but it got me from point A to point B, and was newly promoted to assistant manager, so I was working many late nights by myself. Truthfully, I loved working alone. My boss was super laid back, and his philosophy was, as long as the work gets done, do whatever you please. We even had a shotgun behind the counter, which he taught me to shoot on my first day there. So even though I would be there late, I always felt safe. On this particular night, it was extremely dead, so with my boss's permission, I closed the store early and hopped in my car. It was probably 11:30 to 12 a.m. at this point. Other than being able to get out of work early, this was my usual routine. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I texted my roommate to let her know I was getting home early. We always looked out for each other like that, lit up a cigarette, and then started on my way home. For those of you who don't know North Carolina very well, I'm going to provide a little bit of detail regarding the terrain. From where I worked at the gas station to where I lived, I had to drive down the back roads. These roads consisted of very dense woods on both sides. Sometimes, the woods would seem so thick that you really couldn't tell where you were, especially at night. This could be intimidating to those who don't know the area, but honestly, I was more worried about deer jumping out in front of me, which was a common occurrence in this area. I'm driving down the road, blaring Nirvana, my favorite band at the time, and just being a typical 18-year-old grunge kid who had newly discovered the freedom of being an adult and getting off work. When all of a sudden, I see something in the middle of the road, probably 75 to 100 feet ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it looked too small. So I started to gradually slow down, ultimately coming to a stop. I have to wear glasses when I drive. I mainly need them at night, but my eyesight isn't terrible enough for me to make it a habit. I grabbed my glasses and put them on. Now being able to see much more clearly, I almost shat myself at what I saw. It was a woman. An older woman, wearing what looked like a nightgown of some kind. Her hair was in disarray, she had her hands behind her back, and she was just standing there, in the middle of the road, just staring at me in my car. Let me remind you, we are practically in the middle of nowhere. There are trees as far as my headlights can shine, and it's midnight. I'm naturally paranoid, so all sorts of questions were running through my head. Who is this woman? Where did she come from? It's midnight. Are my doors locked? Why is she out here at midnight? Should I honk my horn at her? Should I call the police? What if she has Alzheimer's and doesn't know where she is? Or what if she's an escape patient? Even though the closest mental facility was 3 to 4 cities away, I didn't exclude that possibility. I thought about calling the cops, but I got my phone and of course, there was no cell service. This encounter went on for a while, just sitting in the middle of the road, mentally questioning what was happening. It's now way past midnight. She's still standing there, just staring at me with this zoned out look, hands behind her back as if she's observing me. I'm starting to get tired of this, considering that I had to be up early for work the next morning. So I honked my horn at her. I didn't expect what happened next. This woman's face turns from being spaced out to complete rage. And she raised her arms up. It looked like she was holding something in her hand. She lets out this horrid animalistic scream and charges at my car. As she ran closer, I realized she was holding something sharp. It looked like a kitchen knife or a piece of jagged glass. During this moment of horror, I had a brief flashback to my stepdad giving me advice when I first got my license. If an animal ever runs out in front of you, turn it into a speed bump. I love animals, so I couldn't bear to hear that. But this time, I was taking my stepdad's advice. I was going to turn this psycho into a speed bump. Serve the Servants by Nirvana started playing on the radio. I mention this because the song has much to do with the aura of the moment. As if it was in sync with this instance in time, the intensity of the song enabled me to let out the most intimidating primal scream that I could, loud enough for her to hear it. The window was open because I had been smoking, and I hit the gas. She was running towards my car like she was going to jump on my hood. I guess she realized I had the utmost intent to hit her, in which at this point, the woman zigzags away from my car and runs off into the woods. Still in fight mode, I didn't question where this woman went. I was just glad that she was gone, so I accelerated on the gas and sped the entire way home. I got home at almost 1:30 a.m. My roommate was still awake, waiting up for me the entire time. She was extremely worried because it was way past the time I said I was going to be home. She had been texting and calling me. When I pulled up to her house, I got all of her texts and missed calls at once, so I started to explain to her what happened. My body went from fight mode to panic as I was recounting everything that happened. My roommate's mother was a 911 operator who also happened to be working that night. So she decided to text her mom to see if there were any silver alerts in the area. Immediately, her mom texted back and said there wasn't. That alone gave me goosebumps to the core of my being. There was no explanation as to where this lady came from. I used to work in a residential care facility, and for a number of years, I worked with a woman named Kajiri. She was generally okay to work with, but she could be intense. The sort of joking flirtation that often found its way into high-pressure environments was common throughout the whole team, but when she directed it at me, it didn't seem so jokey. It took me forever to realize, because I usually didn't notice someone flirting with me until someone else pointed it out 6 months later. But when she started trying to give me jewelry and chocolate bouquets, I finally started to pick up on it. In between things being normal and actually maybe not really normal, there was a long escalation of text messages, comments that made me uncomfortable, personal space violations, dropping by my house uninvited, hanging around on my shift hours after hers had finished, unwanted touching, etc. As mentioned, I can be slow to catch on. Once I realized what was happening, I put as much distance between us as possible. I stopped answering calls and texts, locked down social media, spoke to other colleagues and had them running interference. A lot of interference, actually. At the time, it kind of became a joke, but looking back, it was all kinds of messed up. She even parked outside my house sometimes, and I'd sit in the back room with the light off so she'd think I wasn't home. After a couple of months of my disappearing woman act, she seemed to get the hint and backed right off. I was pleased. We all got on with our lives and lived happily ever after. Yeah, not quite. A few months after it died down, I heard through the grapevine that Kajiri seemed to have focused her attentions on another coworker, Linda. Linda and I had a close mutual friend, but didn't know each other well. I didn't think much other than good luck, you poor sucker. A few months later again, and I got a call out of the blue from a mutual friend. Without preamble, he asked, "Were you dating Kajiri?" No, I don't swing that way. I was shocked. He had been privy to all the awkward details of my experience with Kajiri and had helped run interference. He explained that he had been talking to Linda and she'd asked about my relationship with Kajiri. The story that followed still sounds too fantastical to have actually happened in an actual sensible grown-up workplace. Kajiri had been catfishing her own best friend Amanda, posing as Linda. In a string of emails, fake Linda and Amanda had discussed Kajiri's drug problem, her abusive and dangerous ex, none other than yours truly. There was a story about fake Linda coming out to her family after her brother caught her in bed with Kajiri, and more. The jig was up when Linda got a second job, coincidentally with Amanda's husband, who mentioned how great it was to finally meet Kajiri's girlfriend. Which was a complete shock to Linda when she learned about herself, that she was no longer a straight woman and had a girlfriend. So essentially, Kajiri moved on from me, found a new target, started emailing Amanda from a fake account, pretending to be Linda. She told all these stories about being with Kajiri, about how I was an abusive ex, and how Linda was caught by her family being with a woman and all the drama that it caused. She made up a bunch of insane stories to justify her creepy obsessive fantasies and was telling them to Amanda and other people from a fake email to make it sound like the stories were from the fake girlfriend and Kajiri couldn't be accused of making it up. Here's some highlights of the stories Kajiri had been telling to Linda, her friends, and other coworkers I wasn't close to. She picked her audience very carefully. That Linda and I had physically fought at work over Kajiri. That I had an orgy in the staff office on a night shift with Kajiri and 2 male coworkers. That Kajiri and I had broken up after I cheated on her with another male coworker, not one of the orgy ones. I was really getting around apparently. That I would drug her against her will. That we had planned to have children using a sperm donor, but that I couldn't decide who would have the baby. This woman had been living out a full-on soap opera and using her coworkers and friends as characters. Linda and I reported her to management, and she was immediately suspended, pending investigation. She quit 2 days later. Unfortunately, HR decided they needed to continue their investigation of the allegation that I had an orgy at work, because that was totally plausible and not at all made up by a crazy woman. They put me through hell investigating this imaginary story about me and 2 men and another woman, even though the only men in our department are twice my age and happily married. It made me never want to trust HR again. I left that job a month later myself, and when I interviewed for my current job, she had interviewed half an hour before me, and they were looking to hire 2 people. She didn't get the job, but there have been 2 other openings since, and she applied for both of them. I'm terrified of meeting her again. It turned out she has a history of inpatient psych treatment for delusional behavior and was known to be obsessive about people she took a liking to. According to Facebook, her current girlfriend has a similar first name as me and shares more than a few physical similarities. She still knows where I live. So I'm pretty sure that the current situation is that she's still telling people that I'm her girlfriend, all while she's desperately applying for any job she can get at my new workplace. Okay, so I wasn't conventionally, nor classically pretty. I was the duff in any friend group I found myself in. I never worried about being hit on, disrespected, or kidnapped. Safety concerns were never an issue for me when going out because I was never the one anyone wanted to get to know or be around. I was just too plain. It was always me who had to look out for my friends, male and female alike. I used to go to a local bar almost daily. I didn't drink alcohol there. I just ordered a regular Coke and waited for my ride home. It was my usual hangout spot after work, so I sat, chilled, and minded my own business. A few weeks ago, I had just finished work and was sitting at my regular spot, sipping my drink while working on a new pendant I was making. I had started wire wrapping crystals into jewelry. I didn't expect anyone to strike up a conversation with me, knowing I basically blended into the walls, despite the staff knowing me and paying me slight attention and being nice to me. But this weird guy I'd never seen before came over and sat at my table across from me. I was surprised and engaged in a small conversation that I can't even remember how I started, but he began asking me a few questions about myself that seemed normal and flowed together, so I didn't think much of it. Again, being plain, I didn't think anyone would take interest in me. By then, I had drunk 3 glasses of soda and needed to use the restroom, so I grabbed my phone and purse and went. When I returned a few minutes later, I resumed working since none of my stuff had been touched. I called a waitress over, asked for a new drink, and she nodded. It had always been engraved in me that you never leave your drink unattended. If you do, either have it remade or leave it to the bartender. As the waitress was reaching for my old drink, which only had a few sips taken out of it, the guy got a bit agitated, saying I was being wasteful for ordering a new drink. I looked at him, eyebrows raised in confusion, and asked why it was his concern. It was my money after all, and refills were free. He then accused me of making more work for the waitress for no reason. Annoyed, I told him firmly that it was my business, and if he didn't like it, he could leave. He attempted to wave off the waitress changing my drink, but I had enough of his nonsense and flatly said, "You drink it, if you think it's such a waste." It seemed to catch him off guard. He looked shocked, then a bit angry, before storming off. I then handed the drink to the waitress, expressing unease about the guy I was talking to, and asked her to inform the bartender to keep an eye on him. I requested to have my drink dumped out and only water served from then on. I left for home after being picked up shortly after, and the next day after work, I found out he had been arrested for assault. I only found out today what exactly had happened. Apparently, he had gotten into a fight with the bartender working that night. The bartender caught him tampering with the girl's drink while she wasn't looking and prevented her from drinking it. The guy got angry, leading to a physical altercation. The cops were called, and now he's awaiting trial. It turns out he was trying to see if he could take advantage of someone like me, someone who always let her guard down due to low confidence. He thought I'd be an easy target with just a little attention. When I didn't consume my drink upon returning, he targeted another girl. If he truly was targeting me, I had to question his sanity and sobriety. This happened last year when I was 17, and it's something I will never forget. I was home alone one weekend while my parents were at a work convention out of state. I was upstairs in my room playing Rocket League with two of my friends, talking to them on my headset when I heard a thump from downstairs. This wasn't unusual because I have two cats who often make a lot of noise while wrestling with each other. So, I resumed my game while turning down the TV slightly to check if the noise persisted. About 2 minutes later, I heard another thump, followed by what sounded like a grunt. I told my friends about the thumps, and they urged me to check it out, so I did. I began my walk downstairs, thinking my cats were wrestling rougher than usual. But as I got halfway down the stairs, I froze. I could hear what sounded like men whispering to each other coming from the living room. Crouching down to get a small peek into the living room, I saw 3 large men covered in all black, walking around. I can't describe the feeling in my chest when I saw this. Slowly crawling up the stairs from my crouched position, in typical horror movie fashion, the very last step made a very loud creak. The entire house was silent now, and I knew they heard it. Thinking on my feet, I ran quietly to my room, threw on my headset, and told my friends to call the cops and send them to my house. They sounded confused and asked what was going on, but I just urged them to hurry and threw my headset on my bed. As I got to my door to close it, I heard 2 sets of footsteps coming up the stairs. I knew if I locked myself in my room, they would know where I was. So I closed my door and snuck over to my parents' room, purposely leaving the door open so they wouldn't think to check it. About 5 seconds later, I heard a pair of heavy boots hit the wooden upstairs floor, accompanied by another set of footsteps. They got louder as they came down the hall and stopped by my door. I heard pounding on my bedroom door, followed by a deep voice saying, "Open up," before I rammed this door down. I got chills hearing this. I made a break for my parents' bedroom window and slid it open quietly, but I must not have been quiet enough because I heard heavy boots go further down the hallway. As I was halfway through the window, a man came into view from the doorway and yelled as he ran towards me. At this point, I jumped out the window, and the man grabbed my ankles, trying to lift me back up. Luckily, I wiggled my feet enough to slip out of my shoes and onto the small roof above my back door. The man followed me out the window as the other man came to the window. I panicked and jumped off the roof, landing awkwardly on my left ankle. The commotion upstairs caused the third man, still downstairs, to spot me through the porch window and run outside to chase me down. I made it to the backyard gate, limping on one foot, before the man grabbed me and pulled me back into the yard. I tried to yell, but the man covered my mouth as the other 2 men climbed down from the window. All 3 of the men grabbed me and tried pulling me back into the house. As they got me in the house, I heard the relieving sound of police sirens pulling up. The men looked at each other and said, "Shit," before pushing me to the ground and fleeing out the back door. Limping on my one leg to the front door, I yanked it open and yelled that the men were in the backyard. 3 officers ran into the backyard while one officer helped me over to one of the police cars. They only caught one of the men, while the other 2 escaped over the fence. They threw the man into the other car as the officers came to question me. Shortly after, my 2 friends, whom I was playing with, pulled into the driveway on their bikes and rushed over to me to see if I was all right. I told them I was okay and thanked them for calling the police, potentially saving my life. The man that was caught was charged with burglary and attempted kidnapping. It turns out the men broke in through the basement window. I was thankful to escape with my life and only a sprained ankle that night. My lesson to all is to always follow your gut and never ignore any sound you hear while home alone. My roommate was out of the house for the week, so I had the place to myself. It was spring break, so my college classes were out. I had no plans and really nothing I needed to do. On Monday, I was basically trapped inside due to a huge storm blowing through our city. This was common around this time of year, but it still always seemed worse every time. The trees looked like they were going to blow away, and the house would shake and creak non-stop. Knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep, I decided to just stay up. I turned on the Xbox and started up one of my video games and played for well over an hour, probably until 11 o'clock when the doorbell rang. I paused the game and got up, but then I remembered the fact there was a storm happening. Who would be outside right now? I went over to the front door and looked through the peephole, but nothing. I opened the door. The wind and rain hit me right away, but when I looked around, I didn't see anyone. I closed the door and thought maybe the wind had somehow rung the doorbell. I don't know, it sounds dumb now, but what was I supposed to think? I went back to my game, but only a couple minutes later, I heard a huge crash in the backyard. It sounded like stuff tumbling over and breaking. I immediately knew it was our patio furniture and ran over to the back door. Everything was scattered around the yard, blowing around in the wind. I quickly put on my shoes and went outside, pushing each piece of furniture up against the back of the house. The wind was so heavy it would even hurt sometimes when the water would hit my face. I was rushing, going as fast as I could until I saw someone. They were standing at the edge of the backyard, watching me. I looked back at them for a moment but then grabbed the last piece of furniture and ran inside to escape the rain. I looked at the back door as I dried off, but the person was gone. Between that and the doorbell ringing, I was a little bit nervous. I sat in the living room this time, just scrolling on my phone because I was tired of being interrupted. After a while, I struggled to keep my eyes open. I got a blanket and laid down on the couch. I didn't feel like going upstairs, and the storm was much louder up there. It took a while, but eventually, I drifted off to sleep. A few hours later, still well into the night, I woke up from a sudden burst of heavy wind outside shaking the house. I pulled the blanket to the side and sat up, moving my feet to the floor as I prepared to go check if the furniture outside was still there. But just when my feet touched the floor, they were soaked. It woke me up immediately. I looked down and saw a puddle on the ground right next to the couch. Then I saw another and another, leading in a line across the floor. Inside the puddles were faint muddy shoe prints. I stood up and ran to the corner of the room, heart beating rapidly in my chest. After a minute of hearing nothing but the wind outside, I slowly followed the shoe prints. They led all throughout the house, upstairs and downstairs, but I could clearly tell that they entered through the back door, which I had stupidly forgotten to lock in the rush of getting out of the rain. I locked it and pulled my phone out to call 911, but then the thought crept into my mind, what if they're still inside? I stayed quiet and moved into the corner of the house where I felt the most hidden and called. I waited in silence for them to arrive. When they did, they took a look around, seeing everything I saw, but nothing more. They told me it seems like a personal attack because nothing was missing, and they were clearly focused on my house in particular. However, they walked right up to me while I was sleeping and seemingly did nothing but watch me, which is super creepy but doesn't make much sense. If they wanted to do something to me, they would have at that moment. After some thought, this had led me to believe that whoever it was had actually come from my roommates. They saw me, then looked around the whole house, and then left, doing absolutely nothing. So if this was a personal attack and my roommate was there, I think things may have gone a lot worse than they had. I want to share a story about the time my family's house got broken into. It was a really creepy experience. It happened one dark October evening while I was in high school. Back then, whenever I got home from school, I would go up to my room and lie on my bed and read some comics. On the day of the break-in, it was just me in the house. My family had gone shopping, so I shut myself in my room and lost myself in my books. It was great. I needed the toilet though, so I left my room, and that's when I noticed something strange. The smell of tobacco smoke. This was really weird since I don't smoke, and no one in my family does either. I'd never smelled this smell before in my house, so I went in search of the source of the smell. I began my search in my little sister's room as I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I pushed the door open and switched on the light, and in my little sister's room was a full-grown man. There was a stranger in our house. He was holding his shoes in one hand, and he was rummaging through my sister's drawers with his other hand. I guessed that he had taken off his shoes so that he could move around more quietly. My heart stopped, and my skin went as cold as ice. Somehow I managed to ask, "What are you doing in here?" Despite my fear, he started babbling, creating random excuses, none of which were plausible. It was really crazy. My heart was racing now, and I didn't know what to do, so I just grabbed him by the arm. I didn't want him to escape, and he didn't resist or complain. He kept silent. Luckily, my grandfather lived close by, so I led the intruder with me to his house. When we got there, my grandfather called the police. After some time, the police arrived, and they filled us in on the details. After they interviewed him, it turns out that the man lived in one of the apartments across the street that looked directly into our house. Things got really creepy when he told the police that he'd been in our home several times. He said he liked to break in even when there were people in the house. Despite the police interview, the man broke down and confessed. He said the main purpose of his repeated trespassing was the fact that he was drawn to my sister. He had some sort of obsession with her. He told the police that the day I apprehended him, he was looking for some of her underwear to take back to his apartment. He said that the only reason he picked my sister was due to the simple fact that she was his type. He confessed to entering other people's homes too, anyone who was his type. He said that the only reason he went unnoticed by the occupants was that he was very careful not to disturb anything or steal a thing. No one knew he was coming or going. It seemed that this guy had an understanding of our family's movements, our schedules, that kind of thing. It was clear that he'd been watching our house and our family for a long time. He knew how to get in easily, must have searched for a weak point of entry. He had done this many times without being caught, and my guess was that he began to get careless, which was how I was able to catch him. I only caught him due to the cigarette smell. I can't tell you how horrifying it is to find someone standing in a dark room in your house when you're at that age. I literally have no words for how frightened I was. Of course, we threw away all of my sister's underwear. We decided to get her new clothes. I mean, how could she feel comfortable wearing anything that man had touched? I think my sister has suffered mentally with this, and it's a thing I don't speak to her about. I'm just glad I caught him. Who knows what else he might have tried doing. Maybe stealing the clothes was just the beginning. I don't want to think about it. This happened yesterday while both of my parents were at work. For context, my dad's a mailman and my mom is an RV saleswoman. They're always on their feet, so neither can pick up their phone very quickly. I do have an older brother, but he's at college 2 hours away, so he doesn't matter in this story. I was sitting in the living room with my dog when I heard people talking in the hallway. This isn't unusual because I live in a third-floor apartment and there's a noisy family next door that brings over friends a lot. This was also a Saturday, so I wasn't expecting complete silence. I obviously just ignored the talking since it's not that loud and I had headphones on. But my dog perked up and walked towards the door with an alert posture. The hair on his back was sticking up, which he never usually does. So I got concerned and took my headphones out. This is when I heard the voices from before, which were 2 adult men yelling very loudly in the apartment hallway. I got a bit freaked out, so I pushed my dog away from the door, made sure it was locked, and crept towards it to make sure they weren't near my place. When I looked out, I couldn't see either of them, and because the only blind spot in my peephole is directly to the right, I knew they were at my neighbor's. As I'm leaning against it, my whole front door starts shaking because the men are banging on the neighbor's door and still yelling things like, "We can hear you," and "Come out." But I didn't want to show that I was home. At this point, I grabbed my dog and pulled him into my room while I tried to call my dad, who luckily picked up after a few rings. He told me that I should just stay in my room and stay quiet, and that they would go away. I did stay in my room for the most part, but I called my best friend just to have someone on the phone because my dad couldn't stay talking to me. My room is the furthest from the door, so they definitely wouldn't have heard me whispering to my friend about the situation. After about 5 minutes, I stopped hearing the banging. I told my friend I was going to check if I could hear anything. When I got out there, I didn't hear the banging anymore, so I moved closer to listen. I looked out of the peephole and I could see one of them pacing. I freaked out again and started creeping back to my room. That's when I heard one of them say, "Maybe we got the wrong house." This threw me into a full-blown panic attack. Since my identical apartment door is 5 feet away from my neighbor's and all the others are down a hallway, if they didn't even know the exact number and they obviously weren't scared to bang on an apartment door so aggressively, they would probably come to my door. So, again, I pulled my dog into my brother's room since it had a lock, and I camped in there. I waited for about 10 minutes before I heard the banging calm down again. I couldn't hear any talking from my position. I was texting my friend, who also lived in the complex, about what was happening. That's when the banging started again, but this time they moved to my door. They went through the same routine, but they were much more aggressive. I could hear them slamming, kicking, and hitting my door, all while yelling for some guy to come out. I called my brother later, and he told me there's no way he could have been involved in this, especially because he's 19, and those men had to have been at least 25. I called my dad again, and in his panic, he told me to go out of the room and tell them there's no guys in the apartment, that I'm just a girl. But I just told him I'm going to call the cops. I know they weren't just looking to break down a door, and that they were targeting this guy who did them dirty. But I still didn't want to go out there because one, even if they're looking for someone else, I don't know if they have weapons, and in their enraged state, they might just cause harm. But they still have the info on me, which leads me to number 2. I'm a high school freshman girl, 5'4", and less than 100 pounds. Quite frankly, I have no fight in me. For example, I'm terrified of knives, so I brought a bowling pin from my room for protection instead. Plus, I was in the middle of a panic attack. I stood no chance against 2 adult men at my door, so letting them know I'm a teen girl home alone isn't the best idea. I sat next to my locked bedroom door with my dog as I called the cops. I tried to keep him quiet this whole time, but I didn't want to be suspicious during this situation. I made sure not to talk to my friend while I was out of the room to keep quiet and tiptoe everywhere so they didn't know anyone was home besides the dog. I'm pretty sure they didn't know anyone was home, even though they said, "We know you're in there," during their yells. Because earlier, they were unsure if they even had the right place. I was on the phone with the cops for a few minutes before I heard light knocking at my door, making me realize I wasn't so much in shock that I didn't even know the banging had stopped. The operator said it was the cops, so I ended the call and answered the door. The officers told me the guys took off just before they got there, and they asked me a few questions about male family members and if they could have any correlation with this. When I was 19, I was a Marine and had stupidly used my military perks to get a home loan and bought my first house. I moved a barracks room worth of stuff into this place that seemed to me like a palace. Of course, I went out and bought some bar stools, a futon to sleep on until I got bed, and some used coffee tables for my TV. I also had my dog with me. As I unpacked my meager belongings in the living room, I noticed a car had pulled into my drive and blocked me in. I walked out, and there stood a man offering to sell me a home security system. The man was dressed in khakis and a polo with a name tag that I can't recall, and the car didn't have a logo on it. It should have been a red flag for me, but I figured that some people on the job didn't drive company vehicles. He gave me his card, but I don't even remember the name of the company he told me he was representing. Cue the friendly salesman, giving me his pitch about needing a system and all the perks that would come with being able to watch the exterior of my house at any time. As a low-ranking military member, I knew I couldn't afford yet another thing, so my mind was working to try to get this man to go away. I even considered ninja chopping him or whatever it is that we Marines do in hand-to-hand just to get him to leave. But I'm a sort of passive person. I'm too nice. Nah, let's call it polite. I won't be rude to someone doing their job. I've been in customer service. I can relate. I tried politely declining his offer after he had tried to show me some stuff on his iPad, but you know how persistent these types are. I'll admit to my own stupidity when answering his questions, like giving out too much information. Do you live alone? No, I live here with my wife and our 3 large dogs. At least I had it in the large part. Her and her dogs hadn't actually moved in yet, and hers were just fat, though they were more vicious than my own good boy. But 2 women living together probably seemed like easier targets. I also mentioned being a Marine when he asked. He seemed a bit shocked, but wouldn't be deterred. What kind of security system do you have? My dogs and me. Not the best answer I could have given. I wasn't exactly intimidating. I mean, I would be terrifying if I had a gun or something. I've been using them all my life, and I've never missed a target, alive or inanimate. If you would invite me in, I can show you the best places to set up cameras, he mentioned more than a few times. Each time made me more and more creeped out, thinking that he was wanting to potentially rob me, not that there was much to take. Despite being a victim of assault in the past, all I could consider was a possible burglary and made sure we stayed away from my house while we talked. We were outside for about 15 minutes total, me spending most of that time trying to politely get away from him and retreat inside. I was losing my mind with the social niceties and just walked away, leaving him standing alone in my front yard. I walked into my house and locked the door. He got into his car and left. I thought nothing more of it. After some unpacking, I couldn't do much. I had nowhere to put most of it. I ate some junk food and put together the futon. I got it all decked out with my fluffiest blankets, made sure the doors and windows were locked, and went to lay down in the living room. Looking back, I'm not sure why I didn't put it in a bedroom. They all have blinds, and the rooms take a bit of getting to. Perhaps I wanted to be near an exit. For some context, my back door is a double glass pane door. At the time, I didn't have curtains on it, but I did have blinds on the kitchen window. My kitchen, living room, and dining room are all connected, but there's a wall in the living room that I strategically situated my futon against so it couldn't be seen by the back doors or the front door window. Call me paranoid. I had been laying down for a few hours, and at about 11, my dog got off the futon and went to the back doors. My dog is large and looks like a Rottweiler, but he's never hurt anything in his life. He'll greet strangers at the door with a tail wag and hardly barks. He stood back there for a bit and whined a few times. I ignored him, it was probably a squirrel. But then he started growling, a sound that I'll never forget. It sent terror straight through me as I sat alone in the dark. I had only ever felt that fear once, when a mountain lion screamed, and I realized I was powerless against nature. The point is, these sounds are designed to scare you. And it petrified me. I was frozen and wanted to wimp out, to hide, to call the cops, but I realized if someone was out there, they'd for sure see my phone light and know where I was. So while my dog stayed stationed at the back door, I talked myself up just enough to move off the couch and investigate, still scared out of my mind. I slunk to the kitchen and grabbed a kitchen knife, one of the only utensils I had, and crept to the kitchen window. I was squatting amongst the cabinets so that I couldn't be seen from any windows, trying to gear up to peel back the blinds. My brain was telling me irrational things, horror stories that I had read come to life. To be real, I was ready to punk out. I'm not a brave person. I was in communications for God's sake. Pretty far from any life-threatening situation, while not one that involves people at my house. In the one space that I should consider safe. My hideout, my protection from anything outside wanting in. I've always been afraid of home invasion. It stems from an incident when I was younger that isn't really worth mentioning further. Point is, if someone dares enter my safe place, it's not safe anymore. I thought I couldn't get more scared in that moment, but then I saw a male figure in my backyard, and my heart jumped out of my chest. He wasn't very far from the window I was looking out of. He was bold enough to not wear anything over his head, and I saw the blonde hair in the moonlight. It only took me a few seconds to recognize the security salesman in the dark. He was on the edge of my porch, watching my back door. Watching my dog. I jumped up quickly, climbed over the bar counter, and turned on the lights as I went towards the back door to let my still growling dog out in hopes that he'd at least get rid of the man, if not injure him. No dice. As soon as the lights came on, he had just enough time to go jump the low part of the fence to safety before my dog even got off the porch. I didn't sleep that night. My dog sat on the futon with me, calm as could be, having done his job. The next morning, I filed a police report, but I couldn't tell them his name or what company he was with, having lost the car he gave me. They sent some patrols through the area, and I found out that all legit salesmen should have an ID upon request. That night, I had 2 friends stay with me, ready for him to come back. We thought he might have set the whole thing up to scare me into buying home security. He didn't come back. And I haven't seen him since.